Welcome to St. Aloysius Church. The flowers that are next to me are beginning to fade, but still they have something of the beauty and the colour of God's creation. My mother would be able to tell you the names of these flowers, but I have absolutely no idea. She came from a farming background in Southern Ireland, in Cork, in County Cork, and so she grew up in a farm, and she grew up in an agricultural environment, and she grew up knowing the seasons, she knew the skies and the constellations, and none of those things really are terribly strong in my background, because she moved to a town in the north of England. I grew up in a town, so I've been brought up mostly in towns and cities. You see this difference between somebody like myself from an urban background and my mother from an agricultural background going on in the scriptures, because Jesus comes from that agricultural background. He comes from a small village and he knows the dynamics of the small village. And whereas St. Paul comes from the city, all of his images, although he's writing differently, he's writing letters, but when he does write, you see that his images are really not from agriculture, not from the countryside, not from farming. They're more from the city, and he'll talk about city aspects and money aspects and running and almost the Greek notions of Olympics and that type of thing. Today in the Gospel, we move into chapter 13, which is an axis chapter for Matthew. And it's a series of parables, and you can see from this Jesus' background. His examples are taken from agriculture. They're taken from the farmers and the fishermen and the people who live in the fields. And so let's listen to today's very famous parable of Jesus and the sower.
From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, the Parable of the Sower. Jesus said, "Imagine a sower going out to sow. As he sowed, some seeds fell on the edge of the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell on patches of rock, where they found little soil, and sprang up straight away, because there was no depth of earth. But as soon as the sun came up, they were scorched, and not having any roots, they withered away. Others fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Others fell on rich soil, and produced their crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Listen, anyone who has ears."
That type of agriculture that the sower was being used to illustrate is quite different from agriculture today. The agriculture which had grown these flowers would be quite different. You could imagine the sower. His task was actually very prodigal. He would walk along and take a handful of seed and then scatter it in a broadcast manner, and then afterwards plough the seed into the soil. In one way, it was very inefficient, but given the lack of technology, it was very useful. Jesus talks about the different types of soil because it's quite indiscriminate, really, at times. You get certain expertise with throwing broadcast, but the land itself will always, in some ways, provide a variety. And as Jesus says, there is different types. There's deep soil that is there. There's the side of the field that's been trodden down as too strong. There's the thorns, the thistles that are there that are growing up and that will strangle the seed that grows. All of these different types of soils. Later in the chapter, it said that these are the different types of people that can approach the good news, and that's very good, very certain, a very good parable to describe that. And yet, there are some times when I think that this parable actually is a very good description of what goes on in a single human heart. Because I think as human beings, we live on different levels. And there are parts of our hearts that are just like the different types of soil. Sometimes there are parts of us that are hard, and the good things, the graces of God that land on them, they almost just bounce off. There are others where it's quite superficial, and who we are is actually not terribly deep or interesting, but it's there. And there are other parts that are probably very deep. There's a rootedness, there's something of depth and importance, something of value and treasure. And I suppose if you look at the parable that way, our task, like a good farmer, is actually to see who we are, not to deny, not to say, oh, I'm all brilliant or I'm all terrible, but to notice the different types of soil that are there in different parts of our lives. And to actually say, well, my task is actually to develop the deep soil in as much as possible, like a good farmer, constantly developing the farm, trying to bring things away from being useless and bring things into depth to treat and help and all sorts of different things on the farm. And in one way, that's not a bad idea about how to develop the spiritual life. To look at ourselves, to see who we are with deep honesty, not try to persuade ourselves that we're something that we're not, and then to try to move in the direction where we constantly try to deepen our hearts with God. A good farmer in time of Jesus would always say a particular prayer. The soil in the Holy Land, if you've ever been there, is more of a kind of red purpley type of soil. And the saying of the farmers in Jesus' time was, ours is the red, God's is the green. We sow the seed and God gives life. We make that prayer ourselves this day. We can sow the seed. We can try to do the various things in our hearts which are really important for our development. God will give the growth because he will see the determination and he will see the love that we develop in our hearts.